The sound that ended it wasn't a scream or a slammed door. It was the precise metallic snick of a brass zipper closing on a leather duffel bag. Nora sat on the edge of the futon, a lumpy mustard yellow thing they had dragged off the curb 2 years ago, and watched Colin pack. The apartment smelled like burned coffee and the damp, sour scent of the radiator acting up again. Outside, a siren wailed down 4th Avenue, a Doppler shift of panic that faded into the city's background noise. "It's not a reflection on you, Nora," Colin said. He didn't look at her. He was obsessively smoothing the collar of a custom-tailored Oxford shirt before laying it into the bag. The shirt was new, crisp, expensive. It didn't belong in this apartment, and neither apparently did he anymore. "Right," Nora said. Her voice sounded flat, scraped hollow. She didn't feel the dramatic weeping heartbreak you see in movies. She felt a cold, hard knot of nausea sitting just behind her ribs and an absurd hyper-awareness of the grit on the hardwood floor beneath her bare feet. We're on different trajectories," he continued, finally glancing up. His eyes, usually a warm hazel, shifted away to the water stain on the ceiling. "I'm 30, Nora. I'm moving up at the firm. I need to be attending the right dinners, networking with the right circles, and you're—" He gestured vaguely toward her hands. Nora looked down. Her fingernails were stained with a permanent rim of black grease, a byproduct of rebuilding marine diesel engines, down at the municipal boatyard. A fresh scrape jagged across her knuckles. "I'm a mechanic," she supplied. "You're stagnating," he corrected, adopting that soft, patronizing tone he usually reserved for explaining interest rates. "You don't want anything more than this apartment, that freezing boatyard, and Carmen. Carmen understands the world I'm trying to build." Carmen. The name landed with a dull thud in the cramped room. Carmen was the daughter of a commercial real estate magnate. Nora had met her exactly once at a miserable corporate mixer Colin had dragged her to. Carmen had smelled like synthetic jasmine, an old money wearing a silk slip dress that cost more than Nora's annual rent. Carmen had looked at Nora the way one looks at a moderately interesting stray dog. "She has capital, Colin. Just say she has capital." Nora said, her throat tight. "It's about alignment, Nora. Leverage. Her father introduced me to the zoning board yesterday. My career is about to explode. I can't be tethered to a life that's entirely disconnected from my future." Nora's stomach gave a sharp, acidic lurch. She wanted to yell. She wanted to pick up the half-empty mug of coffee on the nightstand and launch it at his head, watch the brown liquid ruin that pristine Oxford shirt. But an old, deeply ingrained reflex, a discipline forged long before she ever knew what a crescent wrench was, clamped down on her spine. Never show them you are bleeding. Instead, she crossed her arms, her fingers digging into the worn fabric of her flannel shirt. "Oh, you're dumping me for a promotion." "I'm choosing my future." Colin snapped his guilt, finally curdling into defensive anger. He zipped the bag shut with finality. He grabbed his coat, a heavy wool overcoat that Carmen had undoubtedly bought him. "The lease is paid through the end of the month. I'll send a courier for the rest of my books." He paused at the door. For a fraction of a second, his posture softened. "You'll be okay, Nora. You're tough. You've always been a survivor." Then the door clicked shut, the deadbolt engaged with a heavy clack. Nora sat perfectly still for 10 minutes. The refrigerator hummed its rattling, off-balance tune in the kitchenette. The radiator hissed. Slowly, she leaned forward and rested her face in her rough, calloused hands. She didn't cry. She just breathed in the lingering scent of his expensive new cologne, something with bergamot and cedar, and felt the profound, humiliating sting of being weighed, measured, and discarded for not being enough. If he only knew the actual weight of the things she had left behind, to be a nobody in a leaky apartment. If he only knew exactly what kind of capital she possessed. But she swallowed the irony down like a mouthful of ash. He had made his choice. 3 days later, the sky over the harbor was the color of a bruised plum. The wind coming off the Atlantic was brutal, carrying the distinct, sharp smells of rotting kelp, diesel fuel, and dead fish. Nora was jammed halfway into the engine bay of a commercial trawler, her shoulders aching with a dull, throbbing heat. She was covered in grease sweat, stinging her eyes, fighting a stripped bolt on a starter motor that refused to budge. The physical labor was a relief. It demanded all her bandwidth. If she was cursing a rusted piece of metal, she couldn't think about the empty space on the right side of her mattress, or the fact that she had eaten nothing but stale toast and instant ramen since Tuesday. Hey, grease monkey," came a voice from the dock above. Nora flinched, her wrench slipping and barking her knuckles against the engine block. She swore violently under her breath, wiped her hands on a filthy rag, and popped her head up from the hatch. Standing on the concrete pier were Colin and Carmen. It felt like a physical blow. They looked like they had been cut out of a magazine and pasted onto the gritty industrial backdrop of the marina. Colin wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit him immaculately, a cashmere scarf thrown over his shoulder. Carmen was wrapped in a cream-colored wool trench coat, oversized sunglasses pushed up into her immaculate blonde blowout. Nora froze, feeling wildly painfully exposed. Her hair was shoved into a greasy beanie. She was wearing a pair of insulated coveralls stained with hydraulic fluid. "Colin," Nora said, her voice raspy. "Nora," he replied. His smile was tight, uncomfortable. He clearly hadn't expected to see her on this specific dock. "We're doing a site walk. Carmen's father's firm is looking at buying out this sector of the marina. Redevelopment. Condos, mostly. Of course, they were here to pave over the only place she felt safe." Carmen stepped closer to the edge of the dock, peering down at Nora as if examining a peculiar zoo animal. The wind shifted, and Nora was hit with the cloying, heavy scent of burnt sugar and saffron. Carmen's Baccarat Rouge perfume, instantly overpowering the honest smell of the sea. "Colin mentioned you worked with boats," Carmen said, her voice perfectly modulated, dripping with a terrifying kind of polite pity. "It's so brave, doing manual labor. I always say people who work with their hands are the real backbone of the economy." It wasn't a compliment. It was a demarcation line. "You are the help, I am the owner." "It pays the rent," Nora said flatly, refusing to break eye contact. "Well," Colin interjected, clapping his hands together nervously, "we should keep moving. The surveyors are waiting at the harbor master's office. Good to see you, Nora." They turned away. Nora watched them walk down the pier, Colin leaning in to say something that made Carmen emit a high musical laugh. The nausea was back, burning the back of her throat. She gripped the metal rungs of the ladder, her knuckles white, feeling smaller and more insignificant than she ever had in her entire life. She climbed out of the bay and sat on the gunwale of the boat, pulling off her heavy work gloves. Her hands were shaking slightly. An impressive display of restraint, if I may say so. Nora snapped her head up. A man was standing quietly near a stack of wooden pallets a few yards away. He hadn't been there a moment ago. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, dressed in a muted, impeccably cut tweed suit that offered no protection against the coastal wind. He carried a leather briefcase and stood with a posture so straight it looked painful. Nora's blood turned to ice water. She recognized that posture. She recognized the subtle silver pin on his lapel, a crest featuring a falcon clutching a star. "Arthur," Nora breathed. "Your Royal Highness," the man replied. He didn't bow, they were in public, and protocol dictated discretion, but he lowered his chin in a gesture of absolute deference. "Don't call me that," she hissed, looking around frantically. The dock was empty, but panic surged through her regardless. I told the council I'm done. I relinquished the stipend. I signed the waivers. I abdicated my position." "You attempted to abdicate," Arthur corrected gently, stepping out of the wind's direct path. "The Privy Council never ratified it. You remain the Crown Princess of Ethelgard." "I am a mechanic," she growled, gesturing violently to her stained clothes. "I live in a city that doesn't care who my grandfather was. Go away, Arthur. Tell them you couldn't find me." Arthur's face did not change, but a profound, heavy sorrow seemed to settle into the lines around his eyes. He tightened his grip on his briefcase. "I cannot do that, Nora. he said quietly, using her chosen name. Your uncle, the regent. He passed away yesterday morning, a massive cardiac event. Nora stopped. The wind seemed to vanish, leaving a ringing silence in her ears. Uncle Henry, the booming, laugh-out-loud man who had secretly slipped her the keys to the vintage Aston Martin when she was 16. Dead. The succession is triggered. Arthur continued, his voice steady but solemn. The Parliament is in session. The treaties with the Northern Bloc require a crowned sovereign to ratify the upcoming trade agreements, or our economy will default within the month. You are the last of the bloodline. There is no one else. Nora stared at the oil slick swirling on the surface of the harbor water below. Rainbows twisting in the toxic sludge. I have a life here, she whispered, though the words tasted hollow after Colin's departure. You have a hiding place here, Arthur said softly. And it is time to come home. Your country requires you, Majesty. Nora closed her eyes. The cold salt spray hit her face. She thought of Colin's condescending smile. She thought of Carmen's perfume. She thought of the leaky radiator, the empty apartment, the constant grinding exhaustion of trying to prove she could survive as a peasant. She opened her eyes. The steel was back in them. I need 24 hours to shut down my shop, she said. Of course, Arthur nodded. The transport arrangements are already underway. The next morning, the coastal fog was thicker than wool. It hung low over the harbor, muting the sounds of the gulls and the clanking rigging of the sailboats. The air was heavy, pregnant with moisture, and an unusual, deep bass vibration that seemed to emanate from the ocean floor itself. Nora stood at the end of Pier 4. She had showered, scrubbing the grease from under her nails until the cuticles bled. She wore her best clothes, a black turtleneck, dark jeans, and a heavy wool peacoat. It wasn't royal attire, but it was clean. She carried nothing but a small duffel bag. Down the pier, a commotion was brewing. The fog was distorting voices, but Nora recognized the sharp, authoritative bark of Carmen's father, the real estate magnate, accompanied by Colin's placating tones. They were near the harbor master's office, surrounded by men holding clipboards and blueprints. I don't care what the radar says, you don't close the municipal port without my authorization. The magnate was yelling at the terrified harbor master. Sir, I don't have a choice, the harbor master stammered, pointing a trembling hand out toward the gray wall of mist. The Coast Guard ordered a full maritime exclusion zone. Something massive is coming in. Colin frowned, adjusting his tie. Oh, this is a private development zone as of yesterday. Whatever commercial freighter lost its navigation, wave it off. It's not a freighter, sir, the harbor master whispered. Then the fog broke. It didn't drift away. It was physically pushed back by the sheer, imposing mass of gray steel that cut through the water. The low vibration grew into a deafening mechanical roar. Emerging from the mist was not a commercial ship. It was a 500-foot guided missile destroyer, its hull painted a terrifying matte sea gray. The bow sliced through the chop with absolute arrogance. Behind it, flanking like wolves, came two sleek, heavily armed frigates. The radar arrays spun rapidly. The massive deck guns sat silent but menacing. The water in the harbor swelled, pushing high against the concrete pylons, displacing thousands of tons of water as the fleet slowed to a creeping halt just outside the breakwater. A collective gasp rippled through the people on the dock. Carmen dropped her iced coffee. The plastic cup shattered, spilling brown liquid across the concrete. Colin took a step back, his face completely pale, staring at the mammoth warships dwarfing their coastal town. On the mainmast of the destroyer, a flag snapped violently in the wind. It wasn't the American flag. It was a field of deep crimson, bearing the silver falcon and star, the fleet of Ethelgard. The destroyer's heavy anchors dropped with a sound like a collapsing building. Chains screamed as they unspooled. Almost immediately, a black, rigid-hulled, inflatable boat, RHIB, dropped from the side of the warship. It was powered by twin outboard motors that roared to life, churning the water white as it shot straight toward Pier 4. "What is happening?" Carmen demanded, her voice shrill, clutching Colin's arm. "Colin, do something." "What do you want me to do?" Colin snapped, his corporate bravado entirely evaporated in the face of actual military hard power. The black boat cut the engines, gliding smoothly to the very end of the dock where Nora stood. 8 naval marines in full tactical black gear, carrying assault rifles across their chests, hopped onto the concrete with terrifying synchronization. They formed 2 lines, creating a secure corridor. From the center of the boat, a man in a pristine, formal naval dress uniform, white jacket, gold epaulets, a chest covered in ribbons, stepped off. He walked briskly down the corridor of Marines. Colin, who was standing about 30 feet away, suddenly realized the officers were heading in his general direction. He puffed out his chest, stepping forward, his mind clearly trying to compute how he could leverage this bizarre situation. "Excuse me, Commander." Colin started pasting on his networking smile. "I'm Colin Davies, representing the developers of this port. I'm not sure what jurisdiction you—" The officer didn't even look at him. He didn't blink. He simply walked straight past Colin, the wake of his authority, leaving Colin standing there with his mouth open. The officer stopped exactly 3 feet in front of Nora. The silence on the dock was absolute. The only sound was the low thrum of the destroyer's engines out in the bay. The officer drew his sword with a sharp shine of steel, held it vertically in front of his face, and then brought it down in a sweeping, immaculate salute. Simultaneously, the 8 heavily armed Marines snapped their boots together, the sound cracking like a gunshot, and rendered a rigid salute. "Your Majesty," the officer's voice boomed, carrying easily over the wind and reaching every ear on the pier. "The fleet of the Ethelgard Sovereign Navy stands at your disposal. We are here to escort you home." Nora stood perfectly still. She didn't look at the officer. She slowly turned her head and looked down the pier. Colin was staring at her. His jaw had literally unhinged. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and small. His eyes darted from the greasy coveralls she had worn yesterday to the heavily armed soldiers bowing to her today. His brain was visibly breaking, trying to reconcile the woman he had discarded for being a nobody with the woman who commanded warships. Carmen looked like she might faint. The arrogance had been wiped from her face, replaced by a visceral, primal shock. Nora looked at Colin for a long, agonizing moment. She didn't smirk, she didn't gloat, she simply looked at him with the cold, indifferent authority of a monarch realizing that a peasant was standing in her way. The knot of nausea was gone. In its place was steel. She turned back to the officer. "Commander," she said, her voice clear and carrying the distinct, clipped accent she had buried for 3 years. "Bring my bags aboard. We have a tide to catch." The steel hatch of the Admiral's stateroom sealed shut behind her with a pneumatic hiss, cutting off the chaotic roar of the ocean and the barked orders of the deck crew. Suddenly, there was only the low, omnipresent thrum of the ship's nuclear turbines, a vibration that traveled up through the soles of Nora's boots and settled deep in her jaw. The silence in the cabin was heavy, expensive, and suffocating. Nora stood in the center of the room. It was absurdly large for a warship, paneled in dark cherry wood, with brass fittings that gleamed under recessed lighting. A crystal decanter of amber liquid sat on a polished desk next to a secure satellite terminal. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling. The adrenaline that had spiked on the pier, the cold, satisfying rush of watching Colin's reality shatter, was evaporating, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. She felt the phantom sensation of grease under her fingernails. She wanted, with a sudden and violent desperation, to be back under the rusted hull of the trawler, smelling wet dog and stale beer, wrestling with a stubborn starter motor. An engine was honest. If it was broken, you found the cracked valve or the shorted wire, and you fixed it. Ethelgard was not an engine. It was a centuries-old snare of bloodlines, debts, and veiled threats, and she had just stepped willingly back into the trap. Nora dropped her canvas duffel bag onto the immaculate white duvet of the bed. It left a faint smudge of harbor dirt on the high thread count cotton. She didn't care. She unbuttoned her heavy pea coat and let it fall to the floor, then walked to the ensuite bathroom. She turned the tap on the stainless steel sink, letting the water run until it was scalding hot. She plunged her hands in, grabbing a bar of unscented, milled soap, and scrubbed. She scrubbed until her knuckles were raw, until the hot water stung the fresh abrasions on her palms, until the skin was bright red and furious. But the dark crescents of engine oil remained stubbornly embedded in her cuticles. A permanent brand. You can't wash it all off, you know. Nora's head snapped up. In the mirror, she saw a man standing in the doorway of the bathroom. He hadn't knocked. He had simply used an override key. He was in his late 40s, impeccably groomed, wearing a bespoke navy suit that cost more than a car. His silver hair was combed back sharply. He didn't look at her with the deference the naval commander had shown. He looked at her like a spreadsheet that was failing to balance. "Gareth," Nora said. Her voice was flat. She turned off the tap and reached for a thick white towel, drying her hands methodically to buy a few seconds to calm her racing pulse. Gareth Thorne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the man who had effectively run the country while her uncle's health declined. "Your Highness?" Gareth said, his tone perfectly polite and entirely devoid of respect. "I apologize for the intrusion. The captain informed me you had boarded. We have a narrow window before we reach airspace range for the helicopter transfer to the capital, and we have pressing matters." Nora walked past him back into the main cabin, tossing the damp towel onto a leather chair. She went straight to the desk, pulled the stopper from the crystal decanter, and poured a heavy measure of the whiskey into a tumbler. She didn't offer him any. She took a sip. It was an Islay single malt, tasted like iodine peat smoke and old money. It burned a welcome path down her throat. "My uncle hasn't even been dead for 48 hours, Gareth," Nora said, turning to face him. She leaned her hip against the edge of the desk, crossing her ankles. "Can we pretend to mourn before you start handing me ledgers?" Gareth didn't smile. He stepped fully into the room, pulling a thin, encrypted tablet from his inside jacket pocket. "The market doesn't mourn, Nora, and frankly, neither do our creditors in the Northern Bloc. The Regent's death triggered a volatility index spike that wiped out 4% of our GDP by lunch yesterday." Nora took another slow sip of the whiskey. The heat was blooming in her chest, now pushing back the chill of the Atlantic. "Arthur told me about the trade treaties, the default." "Arthur is a romantic," Gareth said dismissively, waving a hand. "He thinks bringing the prodigal heir home fixes the optics. It doesn't. You've been playing mechanic in an American slum for 3 years. You are a massive liability. The foreign press already knows about your sabbatical. They think you're unstable. They think the crown is weak." "And what do you think, Gareth?" "I think," Gareth said, his pale eyes locking onto hers, "that you will smile for the cameras at the state funeral. You will sign the Northern Bloc resource concession exactly where I tell you to sign it, and you will let the adults continue to keep this country from plunging into the dark ages. You are a figurehead, Nora. A necessary biological component to ratify a document. Do not mistake this escort for a sudden acquisition of actual power." The sheer naked audacity of it hung in the air. Nora looked at him. She looked at the tailored suit, the soft hands that had never held anything heavier than a Mont Blanc pen. She remembered Colin just yesterday, telling her she was stagnating, managing her life like she was an underperforming asset. She set the crystal glass down on the desk with a sharp clack. "I spent the last 3 years tearing down cracked marine diesels and putting them back together," Nora said, pushing off the desk. She walked slowly toward Gareth, stopping when she was uncomfortably close. She was taller than him by an inch, a fact she used to her advantage. "I know how machines work, Gareth. I know what happens when a gear strips, and I know exactly how much pressure a valve can take before the whole block cracks." She reached out and tapped the center of his chest, right on his silk tie, leaving a tiny, almost imperceptible smudge of dockyard dirt. "This country is just a bigger machine," she whispered, her voice dropping to a gravelly register. And if you think I came back here just to be a rubber stamp while you sell off our shipping rights to cover your bad debts, you're going to find out exactly how unstable I can be." Gareth looked down at the smudge on his tie, his jaw tightening. For a fraction of a second, the spreadsheet in his mind glitched. "Get out of my cabin, Chancellor," Nora said, turning her back to him. "I need to change for the funeral." She didn't watch him leave. She only listened for the heavy metallic thud of the hatch sealing him out. When she was alone again, her knees finally buckled, and she sat hard on the edge of the bed, burying her face in her scraped, ruined hands. The capital city of Hale smelled like wet slate and old grief. Nora sat on the back of the armored, lengthened Land Rover as it crawled through the rain-slicked streets. The sky was an oppressive, bruised gray, weeping a relentless, freezing drizzle. The sidewalks were lined with citizens, their faces obscured by a sea of black umbrellas. They were silent. The only sounds were the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers and the heavy hum of the vehicle's tires on the cobblestones. She stared out the reinforced tinted glass. Ethelgard, her home, it felt like walking back into a mausoleum. "They genuinely loved him, you know," Arthur said quietly from the seat opposite her. He was staring out the window, too, his hands folded neatly over the handle of his umbrella. "Your uncle. He wasn't a perfect regent, but he had a warmth to him. The people felt it." "He was loud," Nora corrected softly. "He knew how to buy a round of drinks at the right pub and shake the right hands." It distracted them from the fact that the treasury was bleeding out. Arthur sighed a dry, papery sound. "Cynicism does not become a monarch, Nora. Pragmatism does," she countered, adjusting the collar of her jacket. They had brought a wardrobe for her on the ship, a selection of conservative, cripplingly tight black mourning dresses, all high necks and stiff lace. Nora had taken one look at them, remembered the suffocating weight of being told how to sit, how to breathe, and how to exist, and refused. Instead, she had ordered the ship's tailor to alter a men's naval dress uniform. They had stripped the rank insignia, leaving a stark, beautifully tailored black wool suit. The jacket fell cleanly over her hips. The trousers were sharp and practical. She wore a simple white shirt beneath it, unbuttoned at the collar. It was austere. It was defiant. The motorcade passed through the heavy wrought iron gates of the Palace of St. Jude. The architecture here was brutal and Gothic, massive spires of dark granite clawing at the low clouds, gargoyles weeping rainwater from their stone jaws. As the vehicle stopped at the grand portico, the heavy oak doors of the palace swung open. The smell hit her before she even stepped out of the car. The overpowering, cloying scent of thousands of white lilies. It was the smell of death trying to mask itself as beauty. It made the back of her throat close up. It smelled exactly like her mother's funeral 15 years ago. A footman opened her door. Nora stepped out into the freezing rain, rejecting the umbrella Arthur offered. She wanted the cold. She needed it to keep her awake, to keep her anchored in her body. Waiting at the top of the marble steps was her Aunt Margaret. Margaret was the late regent's sister, a woman carved from ice and societal expectations. She was swathed in a veil of black point d'esprit, netting diamonds glinting dully at her throat. She stood perfectly rigid, an imposing sentinel guarding the old ways. Nora climbed the steps slowly. The thick soles of her boots made a heavy, distinct sound. Against the marble, a distinctly unroyal sound. "Eleonora," Margaret said as Nora reached the top. Her voice was like dry leaves scraping over concrete. "Look at you, dressed like a deckhand at your own uncle's wake." "Hello, Margaret," Nora said, refusing to use the formal titles. She didn't offer a hug. Neither did Margaret. Margaret's eyes swept over the tailored suit, lingering with sharp distaste on Nora's hands. Nora had refused gloves. The grease stains and cuts were on full display. "The foreign dignitaries are arriving in 2 hours," Margaret whispered sharply, leaning in so the footman couldn't hear. She smelled of gin and stale powder. "The king of the Northern Bloc is sending his eldest son. You will go upstairs. You will put on the silk crepe de chine dress that was provided for you. You will cover those hideous hands, and you will attempt to look like a woman who deserves the crown she abandoned. 3 years ago, Nora would have shrunk under that gaze. She would have felt the familiar, crushing weight of inadequacy, the desperate need to please the matriarch who held the family's social capital hostage. She would have apologized and run to the dressing room. She thought of Colin again. Carmen understands the world I'm trying to build. They were all the same. Margaret, Gareth, Colin, Carmen. They all believed that power was an aesthetic, that authority was something you wore, something you bought, something you inherited and polished like silver. Nora knew better now. Power was leverage. Power was knowing exactly where the structural weaknesses were. Nora didn't blink. She stepped closer to Margaret, invading her personal space, forcing the older woman to tilt her head back slightly. "I am the sovereign," Nora said. Her voice wasn't loud. It was soft, carrying the dangerous rumble of an idling diesel engine. "If I choose to wear sackcloth and ashes, this court will applaud my humility. If I choose to wear this suit, you will tell the press it is a modern tribute to the naval forces that brought me home." Margaret's mouth opened slightly, the netting of her veil trembling. "You arrogant... If you ever speak to me again like a truant child, Margaret..." Nora interrupted, her eyes dead and cold. "I will strip your royal stipend, seize your estate in the country, and have you relocated to a 2-bedroom apartment in a district that doesn't have a doorman. Do you understand me?" Margaret swallowed hard. The absolute unvarnished threat hung between them, devoid of any familial warmth. For the first time in her life, Margaret looked at her niece and saw a stranger. "Yes," Margaret choked out, taking a step back. "Your Majesty." Nora held her gaze for 2 more seconds, letting the silence cement the new hierarchy. Then she turned and walked past her boots, echoing loudly down the cavernous vaulted hall of the palace. The lilies smelled a little less overpowering now. The Privy Council chamber was located deep within the oldest wing of the palace. The walls were lined with leather-bound ledgers dating back 400 years, and the air smelled heavily of furniture, wax, damp wool, and the bitter black tea that sat untouched in porcelain cups. A massive oval mahogany table dominated the room. Seated around it were 12 men and 3 women, the architects of Ethelgard's slow, managed decline. They wore severe suits and expressions of tightly controlled panic. At the head of the table sat an empty high-backed chair carved with the royal crest. The heavy double doors groaned open. The room fell instantly silent. Nora walked in. She was still in the black suit. She carried a single, battered manila folder she had requested from Arthur 30 minutes prior. She didn't wait for the ceremonial herald to announce her. She simply walked to the head of the table, pulled the heavy oak chair out with a loud, grating screech against the parquet floor, and sat down. She dropped the folder onto the table. "Let's skip the formalities," Nora said, looking around the room. Her eyes met Gareth's near the opposite end. He looked smug, confident in his arena. "My uncle is dead. The treasury is empty. And the Northern Bloc is threatening a sovereign debt crisis if we don't ratify the new trade agreement by midnight." "Did I miss anything?" A man to Gareth's right. Lord Thomas, the Minister of Trade, cleared his throat nervously. He was sweating a thin sheen of moisture on his bald head. "That is essentially the crux of the matter, Your Majesty," Thomas stammered. "The regent had pre-approved the terms before his passing. We merely need your royal assent to execute the documents. The Northern ambassador is waiting in the antechamber." "Pass it here," Nora said, holding out a hand. Gareth slid a thick, leather-bound folio down the polished wood of the table. It stopped perfectly in front of her. The document inside was printed on heavy cream-colored vellum, festooned with wax seals and ribbons. It looked like a piece of history. It looked untouchable. Nora flipped it open. She pulled a cheap plastic ballpoint pen from her inner pocket and clicked it. The sharp click made several ministers flinch. She began to read. Not skim. Read. The room waited. 2 minutes passed. Then 5. The silence stretched until it became agonizing. The only sound was the scratching of Nora's pen as she circled clauses, crossed out paragraphs, and made margin notes in jagged, aggressive handwriting. "Your Majesty," Gareth finally said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Boy, with all due respect, that document was drafted by the finest legal minds in 3 countries. It is highly complex macroeconomic policy. Perhaps if you simply focus on the signature line, Clause 4, Section B," Nora interrupted, not looking up. "The concession of deep-water drilling rights in the Cobalt Sea." "Yes," Gareth said smoothly. "A standard resource lease. The Northern Bloc has the infrastructure to extract the crude. We take a 20% royalty. It's free capital." Nora finally looked up. She stared at Gareth, a terrifyingly cold smile touching the corners of her mouth. "Is that what they told you?" she asked. "Or is that what you chose to believe because you wanted the signing bonus to balance your quarterly report?" She stood up, tossing the cheap pen onto the table. It clattered loudly. "I spent the last 3 years in a shipyard that serviced commercial freight," Nora said, pacing slowly behind her chair. Her voice was steady, carrying the absolute authority of hard-won knowledge. "I know exactly what kind of ships the Northern Bloc is building right now. They aren't building crude oil tankers, Gareth. They're building ultra-deep-water dredging vessels." Lord Thomas frowned, wiping his forehead with a linen handkerchief. "I don't see the relevance, Your Highness." "They don't want the crude oil," Nora snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. "The crude is a cover. Look at the coordinates in the lease annex. They're targeting the thermal vents. They're after rare earth minerals, neodymium dysprosium, the components required to build advanced microprocessors and military guidance systems." A ripple of unease washed through the room. Several ministers pulled their own copies of the treaty, closer, hastily flipping pages. "They are buying our sovereign seabed for the price of cheap oil." Nora continued, leaning over the table, planting her calloused hands flat on the mahogany. "They will strip mine the vents, destroy our coastal fishing economy within a decade, and corner the global market on military-grade tech, all while paying us a 20% royalty on oil they won't even bother extracting. You aren't saving the economy, Chancellor. You're selling our future for scrap." Gareth's face had drained of color. He looked at the paperwork, then back at Nora, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. "That is speculation. Paranoid speculation. The King of the Northern Bloc assured us." "The King of the Northern Bloc is a businessman." Nora cut him off violently. "He looked at this council. He looked at a dying regent and a missing heir, and he saw a mark. He saw a country desperate enough to sign a contract without reading the fine print." She grabbed the heavy vellum document. With one smooth, violent motion, she ripped it down the middle. The sound of the thick parchment tearing was deafening in the quiet room. She threw the torn halves onto the center of the table. "Tell the ambassador in the antechamber he can go back to his hotel." Nora commanded the room, completely paralyzed by the sheer force of her gravity. "Tell him the deal is dead." "You can't do this," Gareth shouted, finally, losing his composure, slamming a fist on the table. "They will call our debts. The banks will freeze tomorrow morning. You are defaulting the nation out of spite." Nora walked back to her chair and picked up her manila folder. She tossed it casually onto the torn pieces of the treaty. "I am not defaulting," Nora said calmly. "Inside that folder is a list of 12 independent shipping magnates operating out of the American Eastern Seaboard. Self-made men and women. Scrappers. I spent 3 years fixing their broken boats, drinking cheap beer with them, and listening to them complain about the Northern Bloc's monopoly on freight routes." She looked around the room, making eye contact with every single terrified minister. "They have private capital," Nora said softly, leaning back in her chair. "And they are hungry. I spent the helicopter right here calling them. We are going to lease our dry docks to them. We are going to undercut the Northern Bloc's shipping lanes by 30%. We will pay the debt interest with the dock fees, and we keep our seabed." She looked directly at Gareth. The man looked physically ill. The spreadsheet had not just failed to balance, she had set the ledger on fire. "I don't play the aesthetic game of politics." "Gareth," Nora said, her voice dropping to a whisper that commanded absolute silence. "I fix broken engines, and right now this council is the broken part. Either you get on board with a new blueprint or I will replace you. Dismissed. Nobody moved. They sat frozen, staring at the mechanic in the morning suit who had just seized absolute control of the country in under 10 minutes. Nora didn't wait for them. She turned and walked out of the heavy oak doors, the smell of damp wool and bitter tea fading, replaced by the sharp, metallic taste of power on her tongue. The Cathedral of St. Jude did not offer comfort. It was a cavernous, brutalist structure of gray basalt and stained glass that filtered the scarce daylight into bruised shades of purple and red. It smelled of damp stone, burning beeswax, and the acrid, peppery smoke of frankincense from the swinging thuribles. Nora stood at the front of the nave, inches from the closed casket. Her legs ached. She had been standing for 3 hours. The black naval suit she had chosen was warm, but the cold of the cathedral floor seeped through the thick rubber soles of her boots, crawling up her shins like ice water. Behind her sat 500 of the most powerful people in Europe. The silence they produced was not peaceful. It was expectant. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of observation. They were watching the back of her neck. They were waiting for her to break, to sway, to show a crack in the masonry. The delegation from the Northern Bloc, Arthur murmured. He was standing a half-step behind her, his voice barely a vibration in the cold air. Nora didn't turn. She listened to the heavy, synchronized footsteps echoing down the central aisle, the polished leather of military boots hitting the stone. Prince Leopold, Arthur added. Nora closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, breathing in the bitter incense. Leopold. The son of the man who had just tried to strip mine her country's seabed for pennies. She turned slowly as the procession reached the front. Prince Leopold was aggressively handsome, tall and broad-shouldered, poured into a pale blue uniform, weighed down with medals he had likely never earned in combat. He smelled of bergamot, an expensive cigar smoke, a scent that immediately brought a sickening flash of Colin packing his leather duffel bag. Leopold stopped in front of her. He offered a sharp, minimal bow, a calculated insult. It was the bow one gave an equal, not a reigning sovereign. "Your Majesty," Leopold said. His English was flawless, but his tone held a lazy, drawling edge. "My father, the king, sends his deepest condolences for the loss of the regent. He was a very accommodating man." The word accommodating hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Nora extended her right hand. Leopold took it. Instead of a polite, limp handshake, Leopold clamped his fingers down, squeezing hard. It was an old, stupid dominance trick. He was trying to hurt her, to make her flinch in front of the cameras stationed in the upper galleries. He didn't know about the starter motors. He didn't know about the 3 years of gripping rusted iron, hauling heavy chains, and fighting stripped bolts in freezing seawater. Nora didn't flinch. She let him squeeze, feeling the pressure against the calluses that coated her palm. Her expression remained completely flat, deadened by exhaustion, and an utter lack of patience for the posturing of rich men. Then she squeezed back. She didn't just grip. She found the metacarpal bones in his hand and clamped down with the mechanical, unyielding torque of a vice grip. She felt the sudden, shocked rigidness in his forearm. Leopold's eyes widened slightly, a flash of genuine alarm breaking through his polished veneer. He tried to pull back. Nora held on, anchoring her weight, forcing him to remain exactly where he was. "Please thank your father for his sympathies," Nora said, her voice low enough that only Leopold and Arthur could hear. She maintained the agonizing pressure on his hand. "And tell him that Ethelgard is no longer in the business of accommodation. We are in the business of structural integrity. If he sends another treaty that attempts to exploit my borders, I won't tear it up. I will publish it." She released his hand abruptly. Leopold stumbled back a half-inch, his hand twitching at his side. He looked at her, not with contempt, but with a sudden, wary recalculation. The mechanic had just bitten the wolf. "I will relay the message," Leopold said, his voice stripped of its drawl. He gave a proper deep bow, from the waist, turned on his heel, and walked back to his pew. Arthur stepped up beside her. He didn't look at her, keeping his eyes forward on the casket. "That was undiplomatic," Arthur whispered. That was leverage, Nora corrected. She turned back to face the altar. Her own hand was throbbing the fresh cuts from the boatyard, protesting the strain. She tucked it behind her back, hiding the trembling. The choir began to sing a dirge, their voices climbing the high vaults of the ceiling, beautiful and mournful. Nora stared at the polished wood of the casket. Inside was the man who had taught her how to drive a stick shift, the man who used to smell of peppermint and old books. A sharp, hot prickle of tears finally threatened the corners of her eyes. She swallowed it down, tasting copper. The machine required her to be steel right now. She could not afford to be human until the doors were locked. A week later, the palace felt less like a mausoleum and more like a war room. The rain had finally stopped, replaced by a biting, clear frost that killed the remaining flowers in the royal gardens. Nora spent her days in the Privy Council chamber, dismantling Gareth's austerity measures piece by piece. She was bleeding the old guard dry. She had officially signed the leases with the American shipping magnates, 7 loud, abrasive men and women from Boston, Baltimore, and New York, who chewed gum, wore cheap suits, and didn't care about royal protocol. They cared about deep-water docks and low tariffs. But Gareth was not a man who surrendered power gracefully. If he couldn't win on paper, he would win in the mud. It happened on a Tuesday. Nora was in the Royal Motor Pool, a massive converted 18th century stable block located on the northern edge of the palace grounds. It smelled beautifully comfortingly of high-octane fuel, old leather, and tire rubber. She was lying on a creeper. Dolly slid halfway under a 1968 Jaguar E-Type that belonged to the Crown's historical fleet. She was wearing her old canvas coveralls, a smudge of grease already painted across her forehead. She was replacing the exhaust manifold. It was the only hour of the day she felt she could breathe. The heavy metal doors of the garage groaned open. "Your Majesty," came a panicked voice. Nora rolled out from under the chassis, wiping her hands on a rag. Oh, standing in the doorway was Thomas, the Minister of Trade. He was sweating profusely, despite the freezing temperature outside, clutching an iPad to his chest like a shield. "What is it, Thomas?" she asked, sitting up and tossing the wrench onto a metal tray. "It's the Chancellor," Thomas stammered. "Gareth, he leaked a dossier to the international press." Nora's stomach plummeted, a cold knot forming beneath her ribs. She stood up, tossing the greasy rag onto the workbench. "Show me." Thomas handed over the tablet. His hands were shaking. The screen displayed the homepage of a major global news syndicate. The headline was massive, bold, and damning: the mechanic monarch, Ethelgard's new queen's hidden life of poverty and instability. Beneath it were photographs, dozens of them, photos of the peeling mustard-yellow futon in her American apartment, photos of her covered in hydraulic fluid at the municipal boatyard, a particularly devastating shot of her sitting on the curb outside a discount grocery store, eating a bruised apple, looking exhausted and hollowed out. There were quotes, too. Anonymous sources from the marina. She was a loner, lived on instant ramen. You don't put someone like that in charge of a country's GDP. He's arguing that you are unfit. Thomas babbled, pacing the concrete floor. He's calling for an emergency session of Parliament to enact a Regency Council. He claims the stress of poverty has compromised your mental faculties. The bond markets are already jittery, Nora. If the American shippers see this, they might pull out. They want stability. Nora stared at the photos. She felt violently exposed, stripped naked in front of the entire world. The humiliation she had felt the day Colin left her rushed back hot and acidic in the back of her throat. They were trying to shame her. They were trying to use her survival against her. She looked at her hands. The grease was still there, dark in the lines of her palms. "Where is Gareth?" Nora asked. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. "He's in the grand vestibule," Thomas said. "He's holding an impromptu press conference. He invited the foreign correspondents." Nora didn't say a word. She didn't change her clothes. She didn't wash her face. She turned, kicked the creeper dolly out of her way, and marched out of the garage. She walked across the frost-covered courtyards of the palace, her heavy boots crunching loudly. The freezing air bit at her exposed neck, but she didn't feel it. She felt a white-hot furnace of rage burning in her chest. She burst through the rear doors of the grand vestibule. The room was packed. Dozens of reporters' cameras flashing like strobe lights, microphones thrust into the air. At the top of the marble staircase stood Gareth wearing a pristine tailored suit, looking solemn and deeply concerned. "It is with a heavy heart," Gareth was saying to the cameras, his voice dripping with faux sympathy, "that we must address the clear evidence of Her Majesty's fragile state. A nation cannot be steered by someone who has spent the last 3 years in squalor, disconnected from the realities of statecraft." "Gareth." Her voice wasn't a shout. It was a bark, sharp and percussive, carrying the exact acoustic weight of a gunshot in the cavernous marble hall. The room fell dead silent. The cameras pivoted instantly. Nora walked through the sea of reporters. They parted for her instinctively. She was wearing stained, filthy coveralls. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot. Grease painted her forehead and hands. She looked exactly like the woman in the leaked photographs. She walked up the stairs until she was standing next to Gareth. He took a nervous step back, his eyes darting to the smudge of black oil on her cheek. Nora turned to face the cameras. She didn't shrink. She squared her shoulders, planting her boots wide on the marble. "The Chancellor has graciously shared photos of my life over the past 3 years," Nora said, her voice ringing clear and loud. "He calls it squalor. He calls it instability." She held up her hands, displaying the calluses, the fresh cuts, the embedded dirt to the flashing lenses. "These are the hands of a mechanic," she continued. "For 3 years I woke up at 4 in the morning. I rebuilt diesel engines for commercial fishermen. I negotiated parts prices. I managed a ledger to make rent. I know what a gallon of milk costs. I know what it feels like when the heating gets shut off in February." She turned slightly, locking eyes with Gareth. He looked pale, the smugness evaporating from his face. "The men in this palace," Nora said, gesturing loosely to Gareth, "have never missed a meal. They have never fixed a broken thing in their entire lives. When the treasury ran out of money, they didn't tighten their belts. They tried to sell the ocean floor to a foreign power to keep their wine cellars stocked." A murmur rippled through the press cord. Pens scribbled furiously. "Gareth Thorne thinks my calluses disqualify me from leadership," Nora stated, turning back to the lenses. "I say they are the only thing that qualifies me. Ethelgard is a broken engine right now. It has been stripped of its assets by men wearing silk ties. I am here to rebuild it, and I don't care if I get my hands dirty doing it." She stepped up to the microphone stand, grabbing the metal pole. "As for the Chancellor," she said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal register, "he is officially relieved of his duties effective immediately for attempting to sabotage a sovereign trade agreement. Security will escort him from the grounds." She let go of the microphone. The resulting feedback whined sharply through the room. Nora turned her back on the press, walked past a frozen, shattered Gareth, and headed back the way she came. Behind her, the vestibule erupted into absolute, deafening chaos. As she pushed back out into the freezing courtyard, the rage finally burned itself out. The adrenaline crashed. She leaned against the heavy stone wall, sliding down until she was sitting on the freezing cobblestones. She pulled her knees to her chest, buried her face in her greasy arms, and finally, for the first time since her uncle died, she wept. It was a raw, ugly sound echoing off the ancient stone, tearing out of her throat. She cried for her uncle. She cried for the loss of her quiet, anonymous life, and she cried for the sheer, terrifying weight of the machine she now had to run. The coronation took place 1 month later. The ceremony was a blur of Latin prayers, heavy velvet robes, and the suffocating smell of myrrh. When the archbishop finally lowered the crown of San Ethel onto Nora's head, she nearly gasped. Nobody told you how heavy it was. It wasn't a metaphor. It was 3 pounds of solid gold sapphires and crushed velvet pressing down on her skull, compressing her cervical spine. It felt like a trap closing. The reception that evening was held in the Great Hall. The chandeliers blazed, casting a warm, golden light over the hundreds of guests. Nora stood on a raised dais, flanked by Arthur and the new Chancellor, one of the American shipping executives, a brassy woman named Carla, who wore cowboy boots under her formal gown. Nora held a crystal flute of champagne she hadn't touched. Her neck throbbed. "Your Majesty." Nora's gaze shifted from the crowd to the bottom of the dais steps. It was Colin. He was wearing a tuxedo that fit perfectly, but he looked entirely out of place. He looked small. The aggressive corporate confidence he had wielded like a weapon in her apartment was gone. He looked nervous, his eyes darting to the royal guards stationed at the edges of the room. "Colin," Nora said. Her voice was flat. She didn't step down. "I came with the American delegation," Colin said, running a finger around the inside of his collar. "Carmen's father's firm. They're trying to bid on the new harbor development contracts. The ones you opened up." "I know who is bidding," Nora replied. He took a hesitant step up the first stair. "Nora, I saw the press conference, the one last month. You were incredible." Nora just looked at him. She saw the calculation in his eyes. He wasn't looking at the woman he loved. He was looking at an asset he had foolishly discarded. He was looking at a missed opportunity. "I made a mistake," Colin whispered, leaning in closer. "A massive, stupid mistake. Carmen, she doesn't understand anything real. Not like you do. I was blind, Nora. If there's any chance we could talk privately." Nora felt a profound, sudden wave of exhaustion. She didn't feel angry anymore. She didn't want to throw coffee at his head. She didn't want revenge. She just wanted him to leave. The realization hit her with the quiet clarity of a church bell. He was a coward. He had always been a coward. He only wanted her now because she had power. "Colin," Nora said gently. The softness of her voice made him look up, a flicker of hope igniting in his hazel eyes. "Yes, you didn't make a mistake," Nora said, her voice carrying the absolute chilling finality of a judge delivering a sentence. "You made a choice. You chose the life you wanted. You wanted capital. You wanted the right dinners." She took a step closer to the edge of the dais, the heavy gold crown catching the light. "Well, Colin, you're at the dinner. Enjoy the appetizers." The hope died in his eyes, replaced by a hollow, sickening realization. He wasn't dealing with the heartbroken mechanic on the mustard yellow futon anymore. He was dealing with a sovereign who had just gutted her own parliament to protect her people. "But," he started. "Step back from the dais, Mr. Davies," Nora said. "It wasn't a request." Colin swallowed hard. He looked at her face, searching for any trace of the girl he had manipulated. The girl who used to make him coffee in the mornings. There was nothing left. Only steel. He slowly backed down the stairs, turning away and disappearing into the crowded room, swallowed up by the noise and the light. Nora watched him go. The knot in her stomach, the one that had been sitting there since the day he packed his bags, finally unraveled and dissolved into nothing. "Everything all right, boss?" "Fiachin." Carla, the new chancellor, asked from her left, taking a sip of scotch. Nora reached up, adjusting the crushing weight of the crown on her brow. She looked out over the hall at the foreign dignitaries, the plotting ministers, the loud Americans who were going to help her save the economy. "Yeah," Nora said, a small, genuine, and deeply tired smile touching the corners of her mouth. "Everything is exactly where it needs to be." She set the untouched champagne down on a silver tray. There was work to do in the morning. Are you ready for more breathtaking drama, ruthless politics, and deeply satisfying revenge? Hit that subscribe button and join our community to explore more stories of power, betrayal, and unyielding strength. Leave a comment below. Did Colin get exactly what he deserved, or was Nora too cold? Your thoughts fuel our next stories. Tap the notification bell so you never miss a new upload, and stay tuned for our next epic narrative.